Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts podcast, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, doctors, life coaches, healers, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Shea Wingate. Shea is a licensed therapist and a grief and loss coach who helps to equip her clients to be able to maneuver through the fog, understand changing relationships with loved ones, and grow around loss. So Shea, welcome. Thank you so much for being my guest and agreeing to do this with me. Now, I want to give you an opportunity to share your story because when I was researching who you are and what you do, I read your story and I was really moved by it. And I think that a lot of people will be able to relate to what you've experienced and the way you've done such a wonderful job of getting through it and now being the person who you are. So if you could, please give a little bit of background about yourself and your story.
Yeah. Well, I am so honored and excited to be here. I love talking all things grief. Probably one of the few people who does, but I do. I love talking all things grief. I am a licensed therapist. I actually studied grief in school and thought I'll be a grief therapist, which is hilarious now because what did I know about grief then? Like nothing. So I worked as a therapist in some general community mental health outpatient places for a couple of years, and there was grief a part of that for sure. Like there was grief there, but as far as like specifically being in grief, that came later. So I was going to, what was this, 2019. I was going to move to Cincinnati from Tennessee. And my mom had gotten diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I remember her calling me and telling me about that. And I just like crying with her on the phone and saying like, I'm so sorry you have to tell me this. And got off the phone with her, called my dad, had like 1 month left on my apartment lease. And I was like, I really want to break this and come home before I move and just be with mom. And he was like, break it, come on. So I did. I went home. I spent the last month working my job, living at home with my parents before I moved. And it was really nice to just be there with them, after work, watch TV with my mom, just have that time together. We were really nervous about her diagnosis, and ovarian cancer is famously aggressive, and it was stage 4. So it was hard. And during that month I was home, my dad had been acting weird. I knew he was stressed with her cancer diagnosis and, probably just scared. But he had been acting weird, not himself, seemed tired and sluggish and stuff. And remember the last day of my work was the first day of my mom's chemo. And my dad was gung-ho, he was going to take her, so he took her. And the next day I was going to take my mom to this follow-up procedure because she had something the next day and I was done with work. And that night my dad was quiet, reserved, just to himself. And my mom is I go to sleep, my mom wakes me up the next morning at 3 a.m. and she's come in our room, dad has had a heart attack. And I'm what? What's happening? I go into the room, and this might be hard for some people to hear. I just want to put that out there. But it was the room was so white, eerily white, like a movie. And my dad's body was so big. Everything was just so heightened because my senses were so heightened. My mom was on the phone with 911, and they were get him on the ground and try to do CPR. And I got my brother, and we tried to get my dad to the ground, and his body just dropped to the ground. That moment I was oh, this is good. He had peed on himself. His face was this bluish color. I don't even know if that's true, but in my memory that's what it was. And we just my brother was like doing CPR, and like the ambulance came and took him away, and I rode with him, and I was standing up there by myself, and the doctor was like, he's not gonna make it. Where's your mom? And who knows like what amount of time passed during this, but it just felt like just slow, like moving through like something thick. And then my mom shows up. My brother had brought her. She can't walk. She's in this wheelchair. She just had chemo. She's feeling all these side effects, feeling terrible. And my dad is dead. And we're like, what? Like, what's happening? Like, we needed him. Like, what's going on? Just this like blur of, like emotions. And it was just horrible. And we were feeling like so shocked. And then everybody, of course, came over to like my parents' house, and all my parents' friends were talking to me about like, if you need anything, let me know. And people had been saying that to me about my mom's cancer. And then this moment hit me. I was like, oh, my dad said that's why they're like telling me they'll be there for me. And it was just like so surreal. So anyway, I end up moving because my mom was like, you've got to move, you got to live your life, I'm going to be fine. And it was sort of just like the next thing. Like my stuff was already packed, I didn't have a job, I had a new job, like I had a new apartment. And I was like sort of in shock, like how a lot of grievers are, like kind of like just so unaware of everything. I moved to Cincinnati. A couple months later, my mom isn't doing well and they want to put her on hospice. And I'm like back and forth from Cincinnati to like Memphis, Tennessee, like trying to see her. And it was just like, oh my gosh, like my dad just died. A couple months later, my mom's going to die. She ended up switching doctors and getting some different kind of treatment and changing her diet and stuff. So she ended up living a year, but she never like really responded to the chemo. But things kind of did settle down, and she was just like gonna, like try this new treatment and see like how, like we knew it wasn't like a cure, but she seemed to be doing a little better. And then January 2020, which is like before the pandemic, if you can even remember that time in our world, I had this like text from my mom like during the day, like a Thursday morning at like 10 o'clock, and she's like, call me. And I'm like, oh gosh, like, this isn't good. She doesn't, like, she knows I'm at work. And so then I call her, and she's like, Karen, my sister, was like found dead in her home, and we don't know any information, but this is what happened. And I was like, okay. So I just like come home, like get my stuff, and I'm just like, I just like walk out of work. I'm just like getting my stuff, like trying to get to Memphis, and just like in this like, okay, let's just go, like kind of robotic way, not even like feeling any emotion. And I'm sure a lot of grievers can like relate to that, like that moment where you're just like, all right, let's just do this next thing. And that's how I had been. And I'm sure a lot of people who deal with like cancer or sickness, like with their loved ones, like you kind of just are in this, like, let's do this, like, don't stop, like, don't get sad, like, we don't have time for this. Like, so we had kind of been in that mentality since dad died and mom was sick. And I mean, of course, all that ended up catching up with me later. But for a while, I was just sort of like, okay, let's go, let's do it. Go home. My mom, I just seen her at Christmas, right? And I see her in January, like a month later, and I'm like, oh, she looks terrible. Of course she does. Like, she lost her husband, she lost her daughter, she had to sell her house and like move into this apartment, like live by herself. She's sick with cancer that's like untreatable. But it was just so shocking a month later to see her just so like dejected. And just, I was like, okay, like this is like the end for her too. And we made it through like my sister's funeral. It was horrible, of course. And just, we're all just sort of on like autopilot and just so confused. It was like an eerie death because like we didn't have answers right away. So I think that was like, she's like my sister, she's 38, she dies in her home. Like we don't have answers right away. Like what happened to her? So it was just like this eerie, lingering kind of like grief. Like dad's death was sudden and I was there. Karen's death is like something I heard about and I didn't have answers and no one else did. like the two very different kinds of experiences with grief. You know, a loved one dies, you think this is how you experience it. Like, no, like it's all so unique. Yeah. And so then like March 2020, the world shuts down. I'm working at a social worker, a therapist at a school. They close the school down. So I just like get in the car and go home and like move into my mom's apartment and telework with kids like on Zoom who don't want to do therapy anyway. And I'm like, look at this picture. Like, please talk to me about your feelings. And then like running to my mom's room and like giving her medicine. And we had started like hospice because she had been at the hospital by herself for a few days because it was COVID. And she really didn't want to stay there or die there alone. So she came home to do hospice. But since it was COVID, like the hospice support was very limited. I've heard from other people that it's pretty limited at home anyway, but I don't know, it was limited. So we were, me, my brothers, my partner and I were just sort of like, all right, we're all like working and carrying on and then trying to like manage mom. Like looking back, I don't know why I worked during that time, but I just guess I thought like, how long is this gonna last? Like, the world is ending. Like we had CNN on all the time, just like disaster porn and that, like coming at us about like all these deaths. And we're just like watching it like so blank. Yeah, and then after like hospice for a couple of days or like a week, I don't even remember. My mom ended up like dying April 3rd, 2020. And then we didn't have a funeral or anything because it was COVID. It was April 2020. We packed up her stuff, like put it in like storage and went back to our lives. And I mean, it felt like everyone's world was crashing down, but also like we didn't know what to do. We couldn't like gather with people. And so we just sort of like kept going for a while. And then in September of 2020, I like really needed a break. It was like horrible. And me and my partner ended up moving back to Tennessee for his job. And I just took time off work and just processed it all and tried to grieve and, you know, handle the estate of my mom and find my bearings again, slow down, feel what I had been running from. And that's when I decided during that process, I was like, oh, like I really like want to like support the grievers. Like this is always something I've been drawn to. I've always wanted to do this. And like, let me do it now. I have this like head knowledge from school and this like lived experience and, you know, grief support. I did all the things, you know, I did the free groups, I did the apps, I tried to read some books, but you can't really read when you're grieving anyway. And then got therapy, and the individual therapy like really helped me. And I was like, people really need this. People really need to tell their story. They really need to be heard. They really need to express everything they're feeling without worrying about their family members because their family members are grieving too, or worrying about their friends because they don't want to be a burden. So I just felt like that was sort of like calling or life choosing me for this job.
Well, with what you have had to experience with grief and losing 3 family members back to back to back, I feel like you are in a position, and well, not only doing that, but then also going through the grieving process and getting to the other side. It puts you in a position now, I feel, to be able to help a lot of people. And that's why I think that this is going to be a special episode, and a lot of people who need to hear that it's okay to feel your feelings and that you can grieve and do it in a safe environment. This is going to be for them. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for doing the work to get to the other side and now being in a position to help people. So just thank you.
Yeah. And like, I think something that in my story that I realized too is like people say you'll feel better after the first year. Well, like I was in a fog the first year. I was trying to, like, I had trouble like going new places. I had trouble like being out of my house. I was trying to like manage. So I think that that's why it's so important to get professional grief support, because when people say these cliche things like you'll feel better after a year, like, and then you don't, but like of course you don't, then you feel like what's wrong with me? And then of course you're not going to talk to anybody about that. So you're not dealing with your grief. So I think me having the lived experience and the research knowledge from school really helps bring both of that to the table of like, it's not just you, or like, I don't know where that year mark came from that people always say, or I always hear that year mark thing. And I'm like, where did this come from? I need to figure this out with this myth.
Right. Well, I think that we may do that now. So,
Do it. Let's debunk it.
all right. My first question is, a lot of people standardize grief and, say what it should look like or what it should be or what it shouldn't be. If we were to really look at grief without putting it in a box, how would you define it?
So I think to grieve is to be human. To grieve is to be alive. We all know loss, whether that's someone I love died, or I'm rejected, or I got divorced, I moved, I have an estranged family member, I have a health complication. I'm not who I thought I would be. I'm not where I thought I would be. Life isn't what I thought it would be. Like, that is grief, that's loss. So we all like know that on some level. And putting grief in a box like doesn't work, because grief is patient. It'll wait for you. If you want to ignore it or avoid it or run from it, like, don't worry, like, it'll wait and it'll find that time in that board meeting that it will express itself. So like, grief isn't just about like feeling sad that your loved one has died. It's like your identity changes, your roles in life change when somebody dies, like on a practical level. Like, maybe you have to be both parents, and so like your identities change, your roles in life have changed. So much about life has been shifted because of grief. And so that's really too big for the box that we try to put it in.
I see. And I like what you said, that grief is patient. It'll wait for you. And I think that's so very true.
Mm-hmm.
Can grief show up, like you said, sometimes like in a board meeting, or if you're somewhere doing something and you have, maybe let's say you just have an emotional trigger, can grief attach to that and try and, rear its head?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, grief is like waiting for, if we're not dealing with it, and even if we are, right, it's waiting for opportunities to be expressed, because it's an emotion and our emotions matter and they're valid and they need to be felt and expressed and experienced. So yeah, like sometimes when our guard is down, it can come out, or sometimes little things will remind you of that person or whatever it is, and it'll just come out, and you'll like these grief bombs, and you're like, what the heck, like, what is happening? But like, maybe it's just so subtle of like, that person looked like that, like my mom used to wear that kind of thing, and I'm seeing that, I'm not even registering it, but my body is, my emotions are, my grief is. And so it's finding that opportunity, my grief is finding an opportunity to be expressed. It doesn't give a if it's a board meeting or something important, or the holidays, or like, it doesn't care about capitalism and getting on with things and producing and being great. And it doesn't care. It doesn't play by any of these rules that we try to play by, and we try to force our emotions to play by. Grief is strong and it's patient.
Wow. That was a great explanation of what it is and how it operates.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like in our fast paced life nowadays, we don't truly have time to grieve because we're so busy with what life demands from us. What happens if we don't give ourselves the proper time to grieve?
Yeah. And I think, that kind of for me goes back to like capitalism, and that might be a whole nother podcast, but like, grief is something outside of all of these like pressures that we put on ourselves and all these expectations that we have. And like, if you don't give yourself time to grieve, like it will come out in other ways or it'll wait. And a lot of people experience the side effects of grief without really understanding it. Like there's been studies of people who have been like hospitalized for mental health concerns, and a lot of the origins of the mental health concerns go back to unresolved grief. So it's gonna like come out in some kind of way. And I like to think of grief as like a beach ball in a pool. And you've ever pushed a beach ball in a pool like down under the water and try to hold it there? Well, like you have to spend all of your energy to hold it under the water because it wants to come up. And if you slip or if you're not paying attention, it'll come up, splash everywhere, and like pop you in the face. And so when we're trying to suppress our grief, it's taking a lot of resources. You can't like swim and enjoy the pool party and be holding the ball under the water. But like if you're afraid of it popping up, then you really got to focus on holding it under the water. But like, why not just let the beach ball bounce around the pool? Like sometimes it'll be far away from you and sometimes it'll be right up on you. And that's grief. Like when it comes, why not just let it come? Because then it'll go away. I mean, it's not out of the pool. It's not like the ball has been thrown away, but it's not always something I've got to struggle with and battle with and control and force, because I don't get to enjoy the pool party if I'm doing that.
Wow, that's a great analogy. Great. And I just thinking about trying to hold a ball underwater. It does take a lot of focus, and you can't really concentrate on anything else. So just let it come up. Let it come up and deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that everybody experiences grief in their own specific way. How can comparing one person's experience with grief to another, or saying things like enough time has passed or move on, how can that be damaging?
Yeah, well, like grief is personal, it's individual. I don't know someone else's loss, like I never will. I'm not in that relationship. So we're talking about grief as someone we love dies. Like I'm not in that relationship with you and your loved one. I never was, I never can be, I'll never understand it. Only like you will understand that. So I don't have any like right or understanding to say that it's been enough time. Like, how do I know? And like the way that somebody dies matters. The way that we find out how they die matters. Who they are to us matters. How old we are. What's going on in our life. Did I die quickly? Was it a shock? Did we have time to say goodbye? Like all of that stuff influences, I guess, like the type of grief or the level of grief or the experience of grief that we're going to have. So if somebody dies by suicide versus someone has a long battle with an illness, or like those are going to be very different grief responses. So who am I to say that you've had enough time, because I don't know that person or your grief or your relationship to them, or like the magnitude of your grief. And I don't know. So I think that can be like very hurtful for people. And I guess like people are trying to say that they don't want to see you like upset, want you to feel better. I mean, on some level, I guess it comes from a good place. I'm not going to say it comes from a good place all the time. But I can understand that sometimes people are trying to be helpful, and for whatever reason, they think that's helpful. But I think that it's not very helpful. I think that listening to somebody and being curious about where they're at is more helpful than telling them what to do or giving them a timeline, rushing them along.
I think that listening when it comes to grief and loss, and you're not the one experiencing it, listening is probably the best thing you can do. I had a friend that told me that when he has anyone that he's close to that loses somebody, instead of trying to figure out the best way to give them what he feels they need, he'll just show up and sit on the couch. Don't even have to talk, just be there. And I thought that was so just insightful and intuitive, because you're giving them the option to talk if they would like to, but at the same time you're also there, so it's comfort without pressure. So I agree with the things that you said, like just be there. Don't try and force what you think is best, or what people have always said, even if it is coming from a good place. We don't know how it will affect the other person, so just be a good listener.
Yeah, and this was really true for me. Like, I was pretty sensitive during my early days of grief. I didn't really know what emotion I was feeling most of the time, but I was overall pretty sensitive. I just had so much emotion. It was sort of like chaos at some points. So when people were saying things to me, I wasn't interpreting them probably in the way that they meant. I didn't have the capacity to be like, oh, well, they meant well. I was just so hurt. I was so emotional. I was so upset. I couldn't do the mental gymnastics of it's okay. They didn't mean any harm by this. So I think if you don't want someone to read you wrong, you try not to tell them what to do.
That's really good advice. So let's say you've processed your grief in what could be considered a healthy way, and there's been a year or a good amount of time. Is it still normal to be triggered by certain events, or the holidays or other times of year?
Yeah. Yeah, grief has no timeline. I will grieve my family forever. My grief can shift over time. It can look different, but my grief is never done, because that's my family, and that's part of my grief is my memories and my relationship and my love with them and my connection to them. So it's never going to be over. The life of the dead is carried in the living. So of course it's still going to get stirred up, because it's always within me. And there's certain times where I kind of know that it's going to be harder. I can kind of anticipate it, and I've kind of figured out my flow with grief, before holidays or big events. The anticipation is hard for me, and then the day is usually fine. But other people might have different. It might be hard on the day, or it might be hard after. But of course, you're still going to be caught up in things sometimes, and not even in a bad way. I can be caught up in things in a way that's wow, I'm really did this, or wow, I was so loved. And so I don't want it to be. I don't want it to not be stirred up, because then it's it's over, and it's never going to be over for me. And if it is over, it's because I'm now dead. So in a way, learning to befriend my grief and embrace it that way has been very powerful. Be it's not this bad thing that I've got to stop having these triggers. It's no, it can come, and it can stir in me, and it can speak to me, and of course it will, and that's okay. And even the good times are twinged with grief a little bit. That's something that I feel grievers will be shaking their heads yes at this point, and then maybe people who haven't really experienced a lot of loved one died kind of loss might be surprised. But when we bought our first house, it was sad. My parents and my sister will never come here. When good things happen in my life, it's a little sad too.
Yeah, I understand that, because those are the good things are things you would have experienced with them. So not being able to still stirs up that emotion. I understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, so on one of your posts, you said, even if you don't acknowledge your grief, those feelings are still in there. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like we said, grief is patient. It is still there. Even if I'm not saying that I'm hungry, I might still be hungry. Even if I'm saying I'm not tired and I'm pushing myself to stay awake, doesn't mean I'm not also tired. Like we can have ands in grief and in life, really, with emotions too. So just because I'm not acknowledging the grief doesn't mean it's not there. Like I can be avoiding it and it's still there inside me. So that's what I meant. Like we think that time heals all wounds and that the passage of time will fix it all. The passage of time can help. It can do some heavy lifting if you're like working on your grief, but it's not going to do everything. It's not going to fix everything. And like we said, like your grief can come out in other ways. So you might not be experiencing it the year after someone dies, 2 years after someone dies, but it's gonna catch up to you.
I see. Why do some people feel that their grief isn't valid?
Yeah, well, like there's some like disenfranchised grief, and I think that has to do with our society too. Of like, you have this amount of time to feel this way, and then it's over. Like, wrap it up. Like, move on. I mean, you think about it. Like, people get like a week off for bereavement leave, if that. Like, I mean, that's even like a privilege to get that. So, if like you're grieving, you might not feel like it's valid, especially if it's like a disenfranchised grief too. So, and there's certain griefs that we're like, oh, okay, that matters. Like your partner died, you can be upset about that. But even if something like we sold our family house, and that was like a grief to me, because it was like this house was like I can go back here when I like fall on my face in the world. Like I always have this safe space to go back to, but I'm not. Nobody's asking me about the grief about losing that house, And disenfranchised grief might be like, well, maybe I didn't have a public relationship with that person who died, so no one knew about the relationship. So then maybe nobody like knew about my grief, and so no one's asking me about it, and it doesn't really feel valid, but it's still valid. All these things that we grieve are valid. All of the kind of secondary loss that come with losing someone is valid. All the shifts in our lives that we grieve, that's valid too. All the things that we have to give away or sell or part from, those are valid too. So, sometimes we don't feel things are valid because we don't really acknowledge that for ourselves. We don't give ourselves that permission to be like, no, this matters. We look outside of ourselves, and sometimes that's not the best thing to do. If you feel like it's valid, then it's valid. And you don't need anyone else to say that it's okay to feel that way. You already feel it anyway. Just give yourself that permission.
Well, that was very helpful. And especially when you talked about the disenfranchised grief, because I know, excuse me, for bereavement leave at people's jobs, I think it varies based on who the person is. So we may we may get to a point to where, like if your uncle dies and you don't get bereavement at work for your uncle, well then I guess I can't really feel the same way I would feel if my job tells me that I get time off for this person. So we may kind of shift the importance of grief, even though we may still feel the loss in the same way.
Yeah, and that's what I like. Like I can never tell you like how to grieve or when it's like I wasn't in that relationship, so I don't know how important your uncle was to you unless you tell me. And you're right. Like an uncle dying isn't technically like the immediate family that you would get that time off for. But if that uncle is really important to you and it really matters, then it really matters. And you're right. Like if our job isn't saying that it matters, then it's hard for us. And sometimes even too with other kinds of loss or like life transitions, like divorce or something like or a breakup or rejection. Like, oh, there's another school for you, or get back out there, or you're better off. Like, and it's like, yeah, but like, can we take a pause? Then do that other stuff? Like, let the griever lead. Or like, if I moved I moved for a relationship and a new job. And like, those are the things that I've wanted. But it still was a loss to leave like my hometown. Even though I wanted that, it's almost like, well, I wanted it, so I can't complain about it. Or it can't be hard. No, I wanted this, and it's hard.
Duality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Two things can coexist at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, yeah, I think that, like you mentioned, if people say, get back out there if you're dating or things, I think that's just a way to avoid feeling, because feeling is uncomfortable. And we've gotten so accustomed to not feeling and not sitting in our feelings, or not feeling our feelings because it's hard. So we create these ways to just breeze through them. And then that's why so many of us later on in life have that beach ball popping up out of the water, because we've been suppressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And like, we're so afraid our feelings are going to drown us. They're not going to drown us. But the reason they're so loud and so demanding is because they've been like ignored by us. But like, it's normal to have a range of emotions. So like, sit with that feeling until it gets boring and like another one's there. But like, if you're always running from it, then it's like this big scary monster in the corner and you can't like face it. But if it seems counterintuitive, but moving towards it will show you that like, oh, it like isn't that bad. Like, maybe it has some information for me or something to say. Or even if it doesn't, it didn't drown me. I can step into it. I can step out of it. And so, yeah, you're right. When people say things like, oh, just get back out there, like, they don't know how to move towards their feelings. They're afraid of being drowned by their emotions. So they definitely don't want yours in their orbit, because what are they going to do with that? They can't even figure out their own.
Right. Exactly. And then I've heard the saying, once if you buy someone's advice, you buy their lifestyle. So if you're looking at people as an example who aren't doing the same things that you want to do, or have been through an experience and on the other side of it, you don't want to look the way they look. And, you could, if someone says to you, just get back out there, you can say, well, I appreciate that, but I think I'm going to do it this way. You don't always have to listen. So.
I love that. If you buy someone's advice, you buy their lifestyle. Absolutely. And like, yeah, like now I'll like on Instagram, I'm like pretty active on there. I'll look at like what people post about like things that other people have said that hurt them. And now I'll be like, oh, this is what I would have said. But at the time, you're just like, what? Like, you're so shocked, like, that somebody would say that. And you're so, like, in the fog and confused and hurt and tired that, it's really hard for grievers to, like, even kind of register what people are saying sometimes. And, like I said, like, I was pretty sensitive. And when people dismissed me, it really hurt.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think when you're grieving, the same way as if you're activated from trauma, a part of your brain shuts down.
Mm-hmm.
So you wouldn't be able to process those things. So you got to give yourself grace in those moments, because you were working with, half your brain or whatever portion of your brain was processing that.
Absolutely.
So we gotta take those things into consideration.
That's a good point. And yeah, like it's protective too for us to part of us to kind of shut down, because like we do need that fight or flight or like adrenaline to kind of like get through some of the things. And like, our bodies know that we can't take all this grief at once, and so they're protecting us from like kind of feeling the weight of it. And that's why the process is spread out over a long time, because our bodies like give it to us a little bit at a time in doses, because like I couldn't have handled the weight of losing those 3 family members. Like, it would have drowned me, but that's not how it works. So part of me is shut down, and I won't know how to like respond. And then also like you said, give ourselves grace. Like, I think that sometimes we feel like, oh, I should have stood up for myself. I should have responded in a different way. I should have had clearer boundaries. I shouldn't have let that person come over, or I should have said what I wanted for the funeral. Like, you were in survival mode for a while. And I'm not talking about a couple of days, a while, like 6 months to a year, for a while. So yes, give yourself grace. And on the other hand, if you blow up at somebody, which I have done, give yourself grace there too. You know, like there's times where I was like, I should have said this, I should have said no. And it's like, I really said a lot on this one instance. And like sometimes, or not anymore, but there'll be early in the grief days, I'd like cringe at like, oh, what did I say? Like I was so like irrational. I was so like dramatic about that. And it's like, no, like I was hurt. I was grieving. Like that's not who I really am. If somebody doesn't understand that, then that's on them. But like sometimes when you just don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything, and then you're kind of like, no, stop. It comes out like pretty like big. So when you're working with a grief professional, you can like process these things and learn how to say something that's like true and safe so that it's not coming out really big. You're not suppressing your grief and then you're not like having to clean up a grief mess that you know, were a part of.
Right.
Yeah, it's so important to like work with someone who isn't necessarily part of your circle because then they're not grieving. I'm not grieving your loss. You know, I speak the language of grief, but I'm not grieving your loss. So I'm not as tied up into it and you don't have to take care of me, you know, like it's different. You know, you're not burdening me when you work with me. It's like you're just showing up for yourself, the full version of who you are. Such a gift to you, to your grief, to your loved ones, to anyone who has interacted with you.
I like that. Next question I wanted to ask is, it seems like there's a lot of pressure to be happy nowadays. Even if we're struggling with something big or having a difficult time, what are some ways to overcome the pressure of just putting on that mask of happy?
Yeah. I think some of the ways to kind of overcome it is to understand that pressure and understand like what's normal. Like having a range of emotions is normal. Humans have a range of emotions. So if you have this pressure to be happy all the time, and then you know a range of emotions is normal, then you can kind of be like, okay, like it's fine for me to be irritable, to be sad, to be feeling angry, guilty, you know, uninspired, all like it's normal to have a range of emotions. And it's also good things in our life don't make us happy all the time. My family is a good thing and they annoy me and they make me mad. And like I don't expect them to always make me happy all the time. So I think that's where some of the pressure comes from too. It's like, this is a good thing. I should be happy. Christmas is a good thing. I should be happy. It's like, no, you know, that's not how it works. We have a range of emotions and even good things upset us sometimes. And happiness isn't like the baseline. Like it's more of like a range, a circle. Like I think of emotions like coming on stage. There's one that just went off stage. There's one on stage. There's one waiting in the wing. Like if we think of happiness as this baseline, then when we're being normal humans and we're not experiencing happiness 24/7, then we think, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm bad. And it's like, no, happiness, constant happiness is like a marketing tool to sell you. So like they're preying on that. And really humans experience a lot of emotions and even good things upset us sometimes. And that's okay.
What are some common emotions associated with grief?
So, I mean, you know, like, I guess let me talk about the ones that I see a lot in my practice and the ones that maybe I feel like might be more difficult for people.
Okay.
So I do a lot of education about like, you are going to be tired for like years. You know, like you're numb, you're in shock, you're like that fight or flight is happening. So that's a normal thing. Like that's a thing that happens, a protective mechanism that comes online. So I didn't cry at any of my family's funerals. I was, it wasn't about me anyway. It was about everybody else who was there. You know, funerals are never really about the family. But I think that, you could feel bad about not crying or that's not normal or something, but it's like, no, you're in this fight or flight. You have a bunch of stuff to figure out. So that's okay. Like you don't have to feel like a certain way right away. Also, I think like guilt is a big one that people don't like and they want to avoid, but guilt is a part of grief, and guilt tells us what matters to us. Like all of our emotions have information. So guilt is like telling you that like this person like mattered to you. And like of course there will be guilt. You'll never have enough time. You'll never have always done the right thing. Like relationships are complicated. So I think embracing that emotion of guilt instead of like beach ball pushing it down, being like, all right, guilt, like come on, give me a hug, let's do this. Then you realize it's more about your values and it's not so scary or so like hard to face. So I think like, yeah, like the kind of the numbness, shock is a pretty normal one that people are kind of surprised by, and then guilt is one too, and like fatigue, very tired for a long time, like confusion, trouble like concentrating, like those kinds of things. Of course, like sadness, anger. A lot of people don't really like anger. I say that anger is important too. There's information for us too. And if you can drop down and see what's below that anger, sometimes like I'm angry at my aunt for not listening to what I wanted at the funeral. And really like I'm sad that we don't understand each other. Like there's probably something deeper underneath that anger. But anger is also important for our boundaries too. It's letting us know like you've crossed the line and that's not okay. And then like anxiety, like when a loved one dies, like our fight or flight is on. And like if you look from evolutionary perspective, like the people that survived and passed their genes to us, like if the cavemen, everyone always talks about this, if they had seen a dead body, like they would have been like, this isn't good. Like some predators around or some like poisonous berries, like let me like be on guard. So being on guard, anxiety is like a part of this fight or flight too. So yeah, like I felt like really like threatened and anxious after my loved ones had died. Like it was hard for me to go places. Driving on the interstate was hard. Meeting new people, like anything that felt outside my comfort zone was hard. My comfort zone got really small. That's like a normal thing. Feeling like a little threatened and anxious, like that's normal.
I think to be able to normalize all of those things is really helpful because, like we talked about, you're supposed to be, happy all the time. And if you're not, then when you experience those emotions associated with grief, you might feel off or like, well, I shouldn't feel like this. Well, Bobby didn't feel like this when his, whatever grief situation happened. So if I'm feeling like this, I'm wrong to feel like this. And I think just everything that happens, just it's supposed to happen because you experienced the loss. Yeah. And I think if we can normalize that would be big.
Yeah. And I think a lot of like something I hear a lot, and I definitely felt it's like, am I doing this right? What should I do? Like, how do I grieve? Like, and so I think that people really want like answers, and because that feels really comfortable. So I think that like I tell people, if you're upset about something, just go ahead and consider it to be traced back to your grief. Like a lot of times people will be like really hard on themselves during grief, or they'll be really fixated on other things like their job. And it's like, well, like this isn't like a program like that you do, or like a thing that you just like get through. It's like to grieve is to be human. So you're going to have to like lean into it a little bit too.
I like that too. One of the things that you mentioned is numbness. Is going numb common when we're grieving? And what are some ways to cope with being numb?
Yeah, and like in the beginning, like it's protective to be like in like kind of like this like disassociated, like numb, like shock state, and that can last for a while. And I think that it's important to work with a grief professional because eventually you might want to look at that numbness as like avoidance. Am I like afraid? Am I numbing out with certain things? Am I trying to avoid? And not that, of course, you want to avoid this. Like, who wants to be grieving? Who wants to go grief therapy? Like, of course, you want to be numb and avoid. And you can still do that. Like, you can't be like constantly in the grief all the time. Like, you still have to live and you still need breaks from it. So, like, can we find a way to incorporate like numbness that's like beneficial to you and like healthy, or doesn't have other side effects that are like, or consequences that are going to be like more complicated for you? And I think when people hear that, they're like, okay, I can do this, because it's like working with a grief counselor. It's like, oh my gosh, I gotta like be in this all the time. Like, when do I have time for that? I can't do this. And it's like, it's not going to be like that. Like, you can still have periods of like avoidance and numbness in your life. In fact, those are needed and healthy. But let's ask ourselves, are these benefiting me or not? Like, is laughing with my friend and watching this like silly comedy like a beneficial kind of checking out time? Yeah, great. Are there other checking out times that might not help me as much? Yeah. Let's figure out like, you know, which ones are going to be helpful for you. And like, of course you need breaks from the grief. Like, of course that's valid too. So numbness is really common in the beginning, and maybe you might need some like kind of strategies for that in a healthy way. And that's okay. We can develop those.
Thanks. Because grief isn't always processed properly, or we just don't know how to deal with it without being, you know, working with someone who's a specialist in grief. What kind of toll can grief take on the body? Like, what are the physical symptoms of grief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you think about grief as like kind of that fight or flight being activated, and that like stress, and like we know what prolonged stress does to our bodies. Like, it makes us sick mentally and physically, and like it's gonna like hit at your immune system. So you know, when you're grieving, you might be like getting sick, like you might be catching all the colds, and like you're gonna feel like really tired, and like some people might not like be that hungry. Concentration might be really difficult. Like, grievers going back to work, that's just so hard. Like, I was in a way like the the chaos of the pandemic helped me like hide under the radar with work a little bit, because like, I couldn't think, I couldn't, you know, be on the way that I needed to be. So if you're, you know, like back at work and you're like, I can't get out of bed, I can't focus, I keep making mistakes, like, yeah, like that's an impact, a process like of grief. And like also people who have lost, there's like research about people who have lost spouses, like they're more likely to have a heart attack than someone who hadn't, like I think a year after the loss. So yeah, like it has this huge impact on our health and our well-being. People like lose weight, gain weight, will have like, you know, side effects like from their grief. Like, one of my clients had like hives all over her body for a while, like kind of unexplained hives, and it was just like this suppressed grief happening, or her body's expression of this like stress and inflammation happening inside. So I would say if you're grieving, like obviously working with a grief, you know, specialist, but then like also it's a good idea to let your primary care doctor know that this is going on, and see if they have any resources, or just like, you know, they'll have a little bit of, hopefully if you have a good one, they'll have an understanding of like what's going on with you when you come in with like some strange symptoms, or, you know, this, like my mom had ovarian cancer, and I just had like the most irregular periods after she died, probably because of stress. But then also like this psychosomatic thing was happening where it was like I was really concerned about like my ovaries, and I would literally have like unexplained pains that I never had before. Went to the gynecologist, got like a ultrasound, everything looks fine. It was like my ovaries were like crying or something. It was just like this pain that I was having. I don't know if that's anyone else's experience, but I know my body, and I know that like there was something that was like off, and I feel like my body was like expressing grief in a way, and that's gonna look different to other people. And so if you have like mysterious symptoms or like just like a hard time managing or feeling sick and blah all the time, like could it be some like grief? And maybe even if it's been 10 years, like could it be some unresolved grief? Could there be some like unresolved trauma, grief that your body's like done carrying and it's expressing it in, ways that you might not have expected?
Are there stages to grief? And if so, what are they?
I don't really subscribe to that. Like the research about the stages of grief was about people who were dying, so not necessarily like the griever, like the person who's left. It was just sort of like, I don't know how that got like co-opted into being like grief has these stages. Well, actually, I think we like things to be clean and neat and orderly and timeline. So I think that's probably why that got co-opted into that. But, like we've talked about, grief is so unique, so personal, so individualized. There might be some sort of general, like blurry pattern that we can all kind of like follow. I like to say, like, I speak the language of grief because I know some like aspects of it personally, but like you're gonna like fill in with the words. Like I understand like the language of grief, but like you have the words within that language for your experience. So I think, as much as I wish I could say like, yes, there's stages, like this one is this one, and it takes this amount of weeks, and you'll feel this way, and then you'll wake up and you'll feel something else. Like it's not really how it goes. And I think we also have this idea that like grief shrinks over time, but it's more like we grow around our grief over time. Like if grief is this like hole of loss, then instead of the hole getting smaller and shrinking and evaporating, it's more of like we grow and build around it. Like a tree got cut down and then like a new tree like sprouts out of that stump. You can still see the stump, but there's like new life like coming out of that. And that's sort of how I think of grief. Rather than stages, I think of it as this like hole that we grow around. It's always going to be there. In the beginning, it just feels like a hole, but then over time, we can put in like other resources and support around the loss. That we're not trying to shrink it. You're not trying, like working with a grief therapist isn't about moving on, getting over that person, forgetting about them. It's just helping you strengthen around that loss. Will always be there, and we'll honor that. And like you don't have to do that alone. It's like kind of a dense fog that you're in. So let someone like guide you through that. It doesn't mean getting over your loved one.
You have really good analogies that you use to paint a picture of what grief is and how it looks. And also I think if we say these are the stages, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if they don't happen that way, then again we're right back at I'm doing something wrong, or what's wrong with me if I can't do it the way it's supposed to be done, and there is no set way for it. So
yeah, absolutely. Like you are going to go through your own process, and that also has to do with like the pace of your life and what's going on in your life too. Like I had mentioned, like when my dad died and my sister died, it was like we were still in like, okay, just keep going for mom. Like it wasn't the time for me to like really like delve into my grief because I was like trying to be there for my mom. Like, and information on her was changing so much. So like I wouldn't have expected if someone said, when your dad dies, you're gonna like, like carry on for a while before you let yourself really like dive into this grief. And I would have thought that wouldn't be me, but like I didn't know that I was gonna have my mom there who was needing us.
That's highly understandable. And then also even as a sibling, we all have different relationships with our parents. So one child's grief is going to be completely different than the other. So I think that that box of this is what it's supposed to be look like doesn't do anybody any good.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because like you think, or I would have thought like, oh, my siblings will understand my grief better than anybody else. Well, first of all, they're also grieving and they had very different relationship with like my sister and our parents. So you're right. Like they had different parents than I had because my parents were different people when they, you know what I mean? Like every child has a different parent, really. And so I think that it was different. Like one of my brothers had a lot of like guilt about his relationship with my dad, and a lot of like anger and like feeling really upset. But like me and my dad didn't have like that complicated like nature. And then my other brother was really really close to my sister. Like they were very close in age, and so like and he lived down the street from her, and he went over like she like cooked him dinner a lot of nights and stuff. So I think that those losses are different because the relationships are different. And you're right, like you think your family will get it, but sometimes they don't. But like probably because they're trying to tread water too and keep afloat.
Right. Everybody's doing their best based on their own lived experience. And if we try and say your experience should be like mine or vice versa, we're doing both parties a disservice, I think.
It's really important to learn the skill of validating and acknowledging like your own grief. It's very important to you. And like when you can do that, then it's okay that other people don't respond in the same way that you do. And like you don't need them to. And grief is hard enough on a family, like to then have that dynamic of like I'm not doing it right or you're doing it wrong or whatever, like that is just it's hard. It's not what you need.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you wrote this. Losing my father, mother, and older sister shook my identity. It took me a while to realize that my grief meant saying goodbye to your loved ones and saying goodbye to a version of yourself. Can you explain that?
Yeah, like I think it's surprising how grief impacted my own like version of myself. Like my sister was older than me, so in a way she was like this like an almost like an aunt or something. Like she would like pick me up from school and like help me with like school projects and like do my hair for like dance recitals and stuff. So it was like losing these like pillars in my life, and I didn't realize like how much I like knew myself in the context of those relationships and like who I was because of like who they were to me. And I say that like after they died, it was like I'm standing on a lot and like a tornado has like blown the house down, and like there's still a lot and there's like a fence around the lot, but like the shelter, the foundation, the house, the roof, like all of that is like gone. And like that's like what losing those three people felt like. And so then I think I said this, like, I can't go back to that home when I like fall on my face in the world. So I really had to like grow up. I was 26 when my dad died and 27 when my sister and mom died. So, you know, like I really wasn't that grown up. It was like, oh, you know, and so I think you just, when those foundational people are gone, you're like, oh, it's really on me. Like, I'm really like I'm like the old one in the family now in a way. And like, nobody's probably really ready for that. And I'd heard this podcast, this doctor was talking and he's like in his 40s and when his dad died, he kind of felt like, oh, I'm like the male of the family now. And I didn't realize like how young I still felt. And then when my dad died, I had to take on that role. And like, can I do it? I'm like, you're a 40-year-old doctor. Like, yeah, you got it. You know, like, you really just like rely on those relationships so much. And, you know, I feel like in a way I'm so like proud of myself for like this like inner strength that I found. But at the same time, like it would be nice to like be cared for in the same way that they cared for me. Like nobody like cares for you the same way like a doting older sibling, and like your parents do. And so when they died, I started like regressing. I started like acting like a lot younger than I was. And like me and one of my brothers would sort of like kind of like talk a lot about childhood memories and like kind of like tease and play like we were like kids. And like I would sometimes say things in like this like funny little kid voice. And I think I was just like part of my inner child was just like longing to be that way again. And I mean, it was like kind of like not like I was surprised. It was kind of like weird that was happening. I mean, not really, because like that happens. People like regress sometimes when like trauma or grief happens. But when it's happening to you, you're like, what? This is happening to me? Like, okay. So I really like longed to express that side of myself for a little bit longer. And then I was like, why am I doing that? I was like, oh, because like they were pillars of my identity. And now like they're still like a part of me, but like now I figure it out. And I was like, I'm not ready for that. But, you know, I worked through it. And I think something that's so interesting was like, I was relating to my friend's parents. Like this one friend of mine, I would go over to their house and like I would sit on the couch and talk to her mom about like hospice and losing a parent and estates. And I just was like really like on one hand I was like being silly, like a little like annoying kid, and then on the other hand I was like 45, like talking about like, oh, like this will addendum. It was so bizarre how I was like in these like two different like, and so just figuring out like, okay, well, which one am I? But it's not like that. And figuring out, okay, who am I now? Who do I want to be? And some writer once wrote like, write like your parents are dead. And I always thought like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that? But then when your parents die, you're like, oh, I can really be who I want, because you don't realize how much you're like doing these things because that's what your family values and that's what you do. And then when they're gone, you're like, wow, I can really do whatever I want. I can really be whoever I want. And so that was not that I couldn't do that before, but it's a different level of it. A different grievers will understand what I'm saying. I mean, you lost your dad. Like, I'm sure you understand that level of like, oh, it's really me now. I'm really doing what I want.
I understand. I get it. I get it.
Yeah. Can you tell me about that for you if you feel comfortable?
Well, it was tough for me because I think I was stuck in a position of trying to be the little boy who got what he wanted, or didn't have to deal with all the things that I had to deal with as a child, with my parents separating and divorcing and leaving the state and only seeing my father a couple of times a year. So I think there was a part of me that was still longing for those things to not have happened or to not exist. And when I didn't realize it until after he was gone. And then so I understand what you mean about writing like your parents are here, because I think at that point that part of my inner child had to go because it was no longer something that could be. So I do get the saying goodbye of a certain version of yourself, because once it's no longer a reality for those parts to be validated, they do have to kind of die in a sense, and you have to become a different version of yourself.
Yeah. And everybody was like, when my dad died and mom was sick, everybody was looking to me to be like, you do this, and I just wanted to be like my dad died. I'm the little kid. Like, right. I'm not gonna call the funeral home.
Right.
Like, I had to, and I did it. But I really didn't want to like grow up in that way. And then I remember like mom was not feeling well. Like, I don't know what my siblings were doing, but I had to go like approve dad's body before the service. And I was like, what? Like, I'm doing this alone. Like, this doesn't seem right. Who's here to protect me? Like, who's here to like take care of me? And then my dad's brother and his wife and my grandmother wanted to see the body before, so then I had to arrange that. And I'm like, I just so it was just such a wake up call to be the one doing those things. It ended up being
Yeah.
kind of nice because I got to see my dad like privately, and you know, he had a lot of makeup on, and that was hilarious because he would have hated that. It was like a little moment, but it was also like, I'm quotes here, I shouldn't have to do this, but like I did. Grief changes your roles.
It's so true. It really does. Well, thank you for going into detail about that. That was very insightful. I mean, the whole podcast so far, this episode has been great. And the funny thing is that when I'm putting together like my outline, I always do it from a sense of, you know, what will other people want to hear, but also how is this going to help me too? And you know, so I was excited to talk to you about grief because it was something that, you know, I needed to dive into a little bit more as well. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who might be struggling with feeling comfortable about talking to someone about their grief or, you know, their feelings, or just talking to a therapist in general, specifically grief, because that's what we're talking about, what would you say?
Mm-hmm. I tell people, like supporters, that like the grievers in the underworld, like they're not a part of our world. They won't be. They need to spend time down there, and you don't have to pull them out of it. Like, they will figure it out with a professional. But like, let them be in the underworld. Like, let them be upset. They already are. A lot of times people don't want to ask how grievers are doing, because they don't want to make them upset. Well, they're already upset. They're already in the underworld. So like, you're not going to make it worse. I think that you can just be honest and just be curious, and you can say like what you're thinking. Like, I want to ask you about your dad since he died, but I'm worried I'll make you sad. Like, just say that. And like, the griever will tell you right away if they want to talk about it or not. If they want to talk about it, they'll talk about it. If they don't, they'll say, thank you for saying that. You know, and it's okay. Like, you can keep saying that. They might not want to talk about it that day, but that doesn't mean it's shut down forever. Like, you keep saying, like, being specific about, I'm talking about your grief. Like, when people were like, how are you? I'm like, which part of me are you asking about? Like, is this invitation to spew some grief on you or not? You know, so why not say like, how has your grief been? Or, I was thinking about your sister today. Like, what's it been like grieving her? Or how have you been feeling about that? Like, just go in with curiosity and be specific about what you're talking about. If you like, try not to give like expectations or like timelines, or like project your own like insecurities on them in a way of like, just get back out there, it'll be better. Or, you know, after a year, like, they don't need that. Just let them be wherever they are, because that helps them get to the next place if they've been heard and wherever they are. So if you want to help them get to the quote unquote next place, like, ask them what place they're in now. What is it like there? Like, how are you like sleeping? Like, you know, what are those emotions like? How big are they? Like, those kinds of things I think would be helpful for people. You know, I felt like I reeked of grief. I felt like people were like, oh gosh, like, she's had all these losses. Like, let me like kind of run away from her. Nobody wants to feel that way. So I remember the people that leaned in and embraced it and were there for me. I don't really remember what they said, but I remember that they were there, and that's all that matters. And maybe being there means like you're there later after everyone's gone. And maybe it means like you're there from like afar in a different way. You don't have to be right like up in their business, like asking them questions and like processing their grief all the time. Like, if you weren't close to them already, like, and they're not coming to you, then they might not want like you. So
Right. Meet people where they are, not where you think they should be.
Yeah, and just because someone has experienced a loss and I'm a grief therapist, I've experienced loss, doesn't mean like I'm the only resource for them or that they're gonna like come to me with their grief. Like they're gonna go to who speaks to them, and it's okay if like your friend or your coworker or someone in your family like goes somewhere else for that support. It's okay. Doesn't mean that you're not a good support for them. They just might need something different right now.
Right. Very true. Very true. Well, Shea, this has been so nice. I think that this was a big topic and a heavy topic that needs to be normalized, talking about it so that people can understand that it's okay to grieve, to talk about grief. And I think we debunked that year like we said we were going to do.
Yeah. If anyone tells you that, run from them.
So where can people find you online and social media?
Yeah, my Instagram, The Grief Girly, and my website, The Grief Girly. Yeah, I would love to like talk to people who are interested. If this resonated with them at all. Your grief doesn't have to be recent. It's not too early. It's not too late. Any kind of grief is valid. And yeah, like I know you don't want to be in grief therapy. You know, you don't want to be dealing with this, but like hopefully after hearing me talk, you can feel a little safer about it and know that it's not going to drown you. We're not going to take away all your resources that you've already got. It's just like grief is a thick fog that we have to maneuver. Like you don't have to do that alone. Like you can have a guide and someone who's not also in the fog.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, for your courage and your strength to go through the things that you went through, to now be a guiding light for someone or others that are in the fog. I think that if one person listens to this and it was helpful, I think we did our job.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Thank you for this platform to share. And yeah, I appreciate your vulnerability too.
All right, Shea, thank you so much for who you are and what you do and the way you do it.
Thank you so much. I had a good time.